Hey everyone, I'm popping in here for a little extra video. Today I'm just sharing a time-lapse of me doing the cover art for the fourth book in my fantasy series, Snake's Blood Saga. I've got about 19 minutes to talk here, so you're just going to get to hear me ramble a little bit about the process and a little bit about the books too. Hopefully my heater isn't too loud in the background. We just suddenly had a cold snap here, and I am not a cold person, So this image, I started sketching it out before I figured I should probably record it. Whenever I do an illustration, I always start with a character sketch that's like just the anatomy and the pose, and then I do the clothing and such on top. I always use green for the people and purple for the clothing, and I don't know why, other than that they're my favorite colors. Whenever I do the poses, I always make myself a reference using Daz 3D Studio. I have character models that I have made for all my different book characters, so I can just load that quickly and then pose them the way that I want, and that way they already have the body morphs that are necessary for their build, their figure. Not so much the faces, because I tend to kind of wing the facial features based on previous artwork that I've done. And also I just use the free version of Daz, so it's not that robust. I try to paint the backgrounds first. I use a lot of texture brushes, and for this one I am not at all ashamed to admit that I used a pine tree brush because there was no way I was going to draw that many pine trees in the background. If I had more time, I might try to do it, and honestly, if I had been doing a traditional painting, I actually really like doing trees. Especially, like Bob Ross method, where you got your happy little trees in the background, and pine trees are really easy to do that way. But I didn't really have time to explore that this time. I only had about a week to work on the book cover, and that was a week scattered in between all the other things that I was doing, so you can actually see, like, in the corner how the date jumps all over the place from the end of September to the end of October with a couple days in between. I was just doing my absolute best to try to fit it in wherever I could. Anywhere that I had 5 minutes that I could sit down and draw, I would try to make some progress. And doing the mountains for me was a really big challenge because, like I said, traditional painting, I would probably do that Bob Ross style because I actually really like doing paintings that way, and whenever I have time, I like to sit down and do, just like a casual landscape painting, except I use acrylics, I don't use oil. I don't have time for oil paint to dry, and I also have a husky, so anything that was oil paint in the house would end up being very full of husky hair before I was done. But this was my first time doing mountains digitally, so I wasn't really sure how it was going to work out, and it took a lot of experimenting. I use an image that I pulled from Unsplash for my palette, and you can occasionally see me tabbing over to that. I had pulled two originally, but I ended up just using one because I liked the colors in it a lot better. There was a time where I would try to manually pick out colors for everything in different scenes like this, and that was horrible because they never looked right. Over time, I became a lot more friendly to the idea of using reference for everything, especially for choosing a palette. And when you're working digitally, there's no reason not to do that because I can go find an image anywhere online that I can just sample colors out of. Especially now that there are a lot of resources like Unsplash and Wikimedia Commons, places like that I can go and I can get public domain images to use. I really try to lean on that heavily to get more realistic environment colors and lighting and everything. I honestly really struggle with finding colors that fit in to palettes that are like existing palettes like this, and you can kind of see me experimenting a little bit when I'm doing the base layer for the skin tones, because I have some colors that I had picked out that would be correct, like local color, which is, without any environmental influence. I just overlay some blue on them and see how that looks, and it kind of looked awful, so I end up having to adjust that later on. I pulled the colors for skin tones out of previous artwork I had done for these characters. You can see that I spend a lot of time referring to the cover of book 3 to get colors to use for Rune. And those get me close. I think the color for the scales is pretty close and I stick to that, but I do end up having to go back and use a photo filter on a piece of artwork that I had done previously to get better colors for the skin tones later on. I always try to block out the figures in a solid color when I'm doing the background so I can get a rough idea of what's going to be covered up. And then I block in the actual outfit in different layers. So there's like her shirt is on a layer, her pants are on a layer, all the leather and stuff is on its own layer. Because that lets me use different effects and things, and it also makes it easier when I can use transparency, like the layer transparency, to isolate what's already colored in and add to that later on with shading and texture, because I love texture brushes. Even though I have a lot of brushes, I really only use a few out of the set. I use a hard round, soft brush with high transparency. That doesn't make any sense. A hard round brush with high transparency, so it gives a soft look. Soft edges are a completely different thing, and I don't use soft edged brushes very often. Mostly only when I need like a really subtle gradient change. And because I'm kind of a glutton for punishment, I usually don't look up references for the clothing, at least not unless I get stuck. I usually put in like a basic idea of this is how I think the fabric should move, and then sometimes I'll stand up and I'll position myself that way in front of a camera and be like, okay, is it actually following the way that I think it should? And sometimes I get pretty close, and sometimes even though I'm close or I'm accurate, I end up not liking the way it looks, and I'll completely change how a piece of clothing is sitting on a character because I just want it to look different. And that's something that I end up doing with Sarah's scarf. I'll color it later on and you'll see that I actually went back and changed completely how I had it draped around her neck because I thought it looked cooler doing it a different way. So if you're still early on in the series, you haven't met Sarah, and she's not a character that I've had a chance to make into a doll yet, even though she's like at the top of my list of if I was gonna turn a character into a doll next, it would be Sarah, like 100%. I love her. She's so happy and cheerful, and she's spirited, and I just love that she's like always smiling. Every time I draw her, it feels right to have her smiling. And I really love that positivity. I like characters that have a lot of inner joy, and I think she's a character that has that, so I'm excited to have her in the series at this point. She was introduced in book 3, and in book 4 she's one of the major players who has a lot of time on camera. We learn a little bit more about her background, and about her ambitions. She's one of few friends that Rune has, especially at this point in the series, so it felt right to put her on the cover with him. There are some points where I was doing the faces where I very unfortunately ran into some errors with OBS, and I noticed on my new computer it does not tell me when it's hit a recording error. It doesn't give me any pop-ups or anything. It just stops, so I don't notice it until I happen to tab back over to check settings or anything like that. So there are some skips forward where suddenly the face will be like done, and I'm sorry for that, but I couldn't really do anything about it. It does it on Rune as well, but hopefully, you know, the gist of what I'm doing on the faces there makes sense. The drawing of Sarah that I used for my reference there is still like one of my favorite portraits that I've ever done. I'd really like to do the rest of the characters in that style of portrait. I think I only did like 2 or 3 of them. I did Rune, I did Sarah, I think I did Kit, and I started one for Vaughn and then I never finished. So I have really bad follow through with my art. It seems like if I have the time to work on something, I'm usually devoting it to writing books or working on my dolls, and art tends to fall by the wayside. So Sarah's bow was a really frustrating challenge because I knew I wanted her to have a recurve bow, and at first I was sketching it with it strung, and then I realized she wouldn't have it strung because she's in like a cold, wet environment. And eventually I realized that we had a recurve bow in the closet that I could use for a reference, and I tell you what, I would never have gotten the angle done correctly if I had been trying to wing it without that reference, because that bow does not look anything like what I expected a foreshortened bow would look like. It's like the back end of it, because it's slightly rotated and held at a downward angle like that, the back end of it just like totally disappears behind itself. So it would have looked really, really wrong, I think, if I had continued trying to wing it. And the bow was something that we found in my uncle's basement, I guess, when we were cleaning up his estate. And my parents kept it in the garage, and when we went up to visit, my husband was like, "Hey, it's a bow!" And Dad was like, "You want it?" So we brought it home, and we've just had this stringless bow hanging out in the closet. I really need to get a string for it so I can, like, I don't know, try to learn archery or something, because I have enough free time for that, I'm sure. So doing Rune's outfit was kind of interesting. When I started writing the book, I knew I wanted them to have a somewhat military looking uniform, because I love military uniforms. And I love the photos that I have of my husband wearing his, but when I looked up military uniforms as a historical thing, I was actually really surprised to see that they haven't changed all that much in the past, like, 1,000 years or so. So even though I was a little worried about it not looking really fantasy, it's like, it's accurate enough historically that I can probably get away with it, and then I just give them, you know, the more traditional looking pants with like the elvish poof beneath the knee. And poor Rune out there in the snow with his lizard feet, he can't wear shoes. So there was a part in the third book where Sarah has some like spats made for him that he can tie underneath his foot and keep the worst of the snow off, but he's still out there like almost barefoot in the snow. Really missing his tropical island by now, I am sure. Most of my characters I've tried to do at least a more realistic looking portrait through the years, so that I can always refer to that for their face shape. But for Rune, I actually also referred to the doll head that I'm sculpting for him, because it's like, hey, I can turn it at any angle and make sure that it'll be correct to his features and his proportions. So that was kind of neat and useful to have in ways that I had not previously considered. So it kind of makes me bummed out that, you know, I'll have the doll finished soon, and I will only have like 2 more book covers in this series to illustrate, so wasted opportunity. I guess I should have finished that sooner. And can I just say that I hate his short hair so much. Rune has had long hair since the character inception back when I was like 14. So, you know, we're coming up on 20 years, that's embarrassing to say, but coming up on like 20 years of him having this luxurious long hair. And then it's short in this book, so I decided to give him the short hair on the cover, and words cannot express how much I hate it and how he doesn't look anything like himself. And I totally stole that sword hilt off the cover for book 2, by the way. I drew it once, and I remember hating that part of the illustration of book 2 so much, and I spent so much time working on that sword. It's like, I'm not doing that again. I'm gonna just copy it, change it up a little bit. It's like, you know, copying my own previous homework, change it up just a little bit so that nobody will know I cheated, except you will, because I just showed you me doing it. Rune uses a hand-and-a-half sword all the time, which is actually a nod to the sword that I made for the doll, because, you know, that's like, I guess I shouldn't say whose it is because that would be spoilers, but the sword that he gets is like a hand-and-a-half sword. So I tried to keep that, you know, somewhat consistent because I figured that's what he would gravitate to. And they would obviously want him to have a sword that he was comfortable with and familiar with, so that's what he always has. And on his uniform, there's like the little patch that has the 3 colors, and that's the symbol of the triad, so that actually matches the cover of book 3. You can see the flags of the triad in the background. And that's because, you know, at this point he's been like conscripted into the army and is kind of serving there against his will. If you want to know why, you gotta go read the books, and I'll leave links in the description for the books. Anybody who's only read the first and is now looking at it, they're probably a little bit confused, but we don't stay on the island forever. I actually got kind of mad at myself for putting so much effort into his feet, because I knew the whole time I was gonna just end up mostly covering them with snow anyway to blend it a little bit better, but I just like to make things hard on myself sometimes, I suppose. What day was this? This was like the 23rd. I was actually really late on getting this cover finished. I had hoped to have it done by like the beginning of October so that I could get the pre-order up sooner, and that totally ended up not working out at all. The book was late coming back from my editor, so I was just behind on everything, and I was also trying to wrap up another series that I had left hanging after I took a break from writing, and then decided that I didn't really want to do paranormal anymore. The genre changed a lot after I started writing it, and I didn't really want to stay part of that, so I was like, nah, never mind, I'm gonna just go back to fantasy because that's what I love the most. And it was also what I had a whole lot of story ideas for, so I mean, I think it was a good decision. I learned a lot from doing the others, but fantasy is always going to have my heart. It's always going to be my first choice, what I enjoy writing the most. I'm actually planning to do NaNoWriMo this year, which is probably an absolutely horrible idea, but I'm really good at horrible ideas. And yeah, I guess I'm officially out of stuff to talk about, so this one is book 4, Serpent's Wake, and it'll release on November 28th. I'll leave the pre-order links in the video description, and also a link to the first book in case you have no idea what I'm talking about, because I'm sure there are people who have not been along for the very long ride of me writing the books. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll leave the first book as well, and you can go check that out. So add some snow there, just make it look a little more cold. I love Photoshop for that because I think about trying to do snowflakes with traditional media, and it's like, I'm really glad that I ended up doing digital for all these covers. And alright, that's it. I'll just stop there. Thanks for watching. Bye.